there, I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. We're going to begin here today with a 1-inch flat-headed brush because it can carry quite a lot of paint. However, we are going to cover the entirety of this canvas, so if you'd like to work with something a little bit bigger, you are more than welcome to. That said, before we begin, we are going to dip the bottom third of our brush into some water here and wipe off the excess on the side of our water dish. This is going to ensure that all of the bristles are nice and condensed so we don't have any strays. It's also going to keep the paint wet for a longer period of time, which will really help us blend the very large background. This is a great technique for just keeping that paint wet a little bit longer. However, you do want to work off all of that excess because the water will thin the paint, and if you thin it too much, it'll be a little bit hard to apply. So we're looking for damp, not wet. Now, while our final image is going to be quite colorful, we are beginning here with just some regular Mars Black paint. And I'm going to use this as a base color for our canvas, and then we'll add all of those stars, all of those vibrant applications on top of it. Now, the water on our brush is very much helping us in this situation as it's keeping the paint wet for a longer period of time so that, as you can see, I can go back and blend upwards into our previous applications. And it's also worth noting that this is a great way of just kind of getting started with your canvas. We're essentially giving ourselves an opportunity to get familiar with the brush, with our strokes, and do all of that before we get into any actual detail work. I generally love starting in the backgrounds because it's a great place to kind of warm up. You don't have to do all of these very meticulous applications. It's generally more so working on a more simplified background and just getting comfortable. That said, we are going to be slightly careful, and as you can see, once I'm done with a general area, I like to go over it very softly with my brush and just ensure that we don't have too much of varied applications that kind of go in different directions and might be noticeable later on. We're trying to keep it fairly consistent, and I'm also trying to not spread out paint too far on the canvas, because if we do, eventually it might just get a little grainy, like you can see here. You can see all of the canvas showing through. So use a decent amount of paint, ensure that this background is nice and thick, and it'll be significantly better looking in the end. Now, I would like to add that often you'll hear painters note that you shouldn't paint with a pure black paint because it's void of hue and therefore mood, a feeling, right? It doesn't stray towards warm or cool. And I think that's a fair, thought process to go through, but what we're going to do in a little bit, once this is applied, once it's fully dried, we're going to apply and glaze on a lot of different colors, making this initially just black background significantly more complex, and it's going to add in everything that you'd initially kind of worry that we just won't be able to kind of convey without actual color. So recognize that there are different rules you'll hear throughout painting over the years, and while a lot of them have good intentions, it's important to recognize that the painting process is a very individual thing, and you're going to want to break a lot of those rules to make your own pieces, to come up with your own techniques, to really just enjoy. And I'd like to start this lesson off by just reminding you that while I am going to teach you how to do this in this lesson, while we're going to work through this together, you are more than welcome to take artistic liberties, go off, try your own things, have fun with it, make it your own. And just because I'm telling you you should do this, you should do that, you should try this, you should try that, recognize that it's your piece and you could do with it what you'd like to. I'm really just here to help you, guide you on the way, and have some fun in the process. Now, as you can see here, we did go ahead and let that black backdrop dry, then we went ahead and did another layer. Then once that was dry, we did start the drawing process, but we did so with a rather unconventional medium. For the drawing process, I very much like to use Conte, which is essentially like a colored chalk. And I like this a lot because it allows me to allocate different colors to my subjects, and it comes off with water, which means we can change our drawing as we go. I guess it's also worth noting that it doesn't bleed into delicate pigments. So if you're working with a graphite or a charcoal, sometimes that black can kind of work its way into a yellow or a titanium white and just kind of make it look a little bit dirty. This does not have that issue, and it's another reason I'm a big fan. Again, one of those things that I figured out a while ago, and it's just so useful when working on a black backdrop. Wanted to pass that on to you. With that, we are now going to start working with a different brush. Here we have a round pointed brush, and this has multiple uses. We can use the top point of it to render some really sharp line work, but we can also use this very soft rounded edge to instigate some really nice blends and gradients. So multi-purpose, really fantastic. This one is about 1/4 of an inch wide. We will be working with a smaller one later on, but this will be great for plotting in the larger colors. So now we're going to dive into our palette, and as you can see, we have a cadmium red light hue and a cadmium red medium hue. This one is much more of a natural red, while this one leans a bit more towards orange. We're going to use both of these in this because if you look kind of more so in the center of the reference photo, you do have a bit more of an orange. As you get towards the edge, it's a bit deeper, it's more of a red, it kind of blends into a purple at times, and you're going to be able to mix your blue with this red significantly easier because this has a bit of yellow in it, just naturally, innately, and that'll kind of tone down the purples that you can create. So between these two, we have a lot of freedom and we'll be able to accomplish quite a bit. With that, we are going to begin with that round pointed brush. It is nice and damp, and now we're going to grab some of that cadmium red, move that down here on our palette, brand new, fresh spot. We'll grab the smallest hint of Mars Black and the smallest hint of titanium white, and I'm doing this to thicken the pigment a little bit and also to desaturate it. I can build up saturation over time, but I don't want to kind of go all in initially. Now, I know that this line is essentially where our really bright light emanates from, so we're going to walk that line initially, just like this. I know that this area is essentially full of red, and then I'm going to move my way out to the right. Let it dissipate. The more we move the paint, the more transparent it's going to get because we're going to run out, and we're just going to have the water left on our brush carrying very minimal amounts. See that? I'm tapping the canvas extremely softly with my brush because I don't want it to create too many unintentional lines, but also recognize that the aesthetic that we are building here is very line work heavy. There's a lot of movements, as you can see through this part of the process. And so it really isn't the worst thing if you have some brush stroke and some texture in there. It almost looks like lightning, tree branches. And often I find when people start working with acrylic paints, they're initially not wildly happy at the start of the painting process because acrylics generally tend to take multiple layers. We need to go in a lot, we need to change our colors, we need to build things up, because right now acrylics, they're very thin. You can see this canvas showing through just about all of our applications, and that's going to make it look unfinished. And that's okay. It's part of the process. It's always going to be with the medium. And recognize that if it doesn't look great from the start, it's not because of a lack of talent on your part. It really is just the limitations of the medium, but they're kind of great because it means it takes a while to build up your layers, your applications, so you have some opportunities to try different things, to learn in the process. That first application you make, it isn't wildly impactful, but more so an opportunity to learn and just kind of get on track. Now I'm going back to that area closest to the light, and I'm incorporating a bit more of an application, building it up, because every time you add to a layer, every time you do another layer on top, we start to lose some of that Mars black that's under it, and we start to see the natural color that we have on our palette. Because with our first application, we're not going to get this color directly on here. We're going to get a combination of this and the color on our brush, because again, it's semi-transparent. We can see it through. And so this again is just something we need to build up to. There we go. Have a nice base. But as I mentioned, predominantly we're going to want the cadmium red light hue, the one that leans a little bit more towards orange, in the center of the painting. And then we move out more towards red as we kind of continue the process. So, now that we have that nice base, we grab some of that cadmium red light hue. Again, smallest hint of Mars Black. We really don't want much of the Mars Black or Titanium White right now. They're both incredibly strong pigments. They can overwhelm a hue. Just look at that. Look how that color changed to that color so quickly. Completely different. We'll re-interject more of that orange, and this is definitely more so what I wanted. So here we have a bit of a more subtle orange. And again, I'm trying to start with the more subtle pigments because we can build up to the saturation throughout the painting process. But the more subtle it is initially, the more room we have to play. There we go. So I'm going over the most prominent areas, predominantly in the center, starting to work this application outwards. See lots of these brush strokes, but some of them are much more soft. And initially this is definitely going to look like an abstract painting. We'll get it to look like space in the end, but recognize that there's going to be this process of applying layers, building bases, and then reapplying. I think I'm also going to make my version of this slightly more orange than the reference photo, because the reference photo has a lot of blue, and blue and orange are complementary colors. They help each other stand out. So we can edit the initial image, the initial idea, and create something that in the end will have a bit more of a pop and a bit more of a contrast. You don't have to do it, but it's an artistic liberty you can take and it can look quite nice. Now, in that top section, we kind of bounced from color to color to create this very eclectic mix, and that's one way of going about it, but you can also create that eclectic mix over multiple layers and start with something fairly similar, fairly generic, and it may inspire more confidence as you paint, as it won't kind of initially look as messy, it'll just look more simple. And both processes will get you to the same end result or something very similar, but it kind of depends on how you want to go about the painting process. So I'm going to show you how I would go about painting it in the other way as well. So here yet again, I have a red. This time it's about an even mixture of both the red and the orange. I'm starting on the edge as we did initially, and I start to work my way out slowly, letting that paint dissipate, moving over the areas in which I've drawn. Again, you can see that none of this shows through the actual paint. I'll also blend it up into that previous application. There we go. We'll lead this back in, just looking over at the reference photo, seeing how all of this should move in general. And then I'm doing a soft blend using the side of my brush, working in circles, to move the pigment out a little bit. This is making it so that we're adding complexity to the black background. Has a bit of a warmer hue to it now, has a bit more color depth. It has less contrast, but it'll look a lot better, especially as we start to build up these contrasts later on. There we go. As you can see though, definitely looks less messy than our initial application that we did. But once we add the complexity to it, once we go up and we clean up the top application, you'll see that there really are multiple ways of going about this and being successful with it. There we go. going to create a little bit more line work. I am deviating slightly from my drawing, but we're trying to keep that general idea, those general movements and that composition in there, because I know I like the composition. Do I think I can add to it at points? I do. And we do go about doing that. There we go. Continuously just building that up. Doing lots of these little taps to create that line work, to make it a bit more dynamic. If this whole thing was entirely soft, it might look a little visually boring. So I am trying to give it some nice playful edges, some real movements, keeping it dynamic. Very happy with how this is turning out though, for the base layer, which again, is meant to be just rather simple. There we go. And then I have some soft line work that just moves down here. Getting a little tongue-tied today. That said, I think I say that every day. Pretty much every lesson. Again, I always just kind of hope it adds to the comedy, makes it a little more entertaining. Try not to take all of this too seriously. We are here to have fun. Do a little painting, chat. And I have to tell you, I have been really wanting to do this for a while now. Used to do a lot of space scenes, probably haven't done one in about a year. Definitely have it in my system, definitely want to do more, but really having fun getting back to it. Definitely something that was a real spurt of inspiration. And, you know, as someone who's been doing this for 10 years, more, so nice when those days come. With that, we are going to create a very subtle look in the background here. So I have a lot of water on my brush right now. It's thinning the paint to an extreme extent, and we're getting what's almost a glaze. And a glaze is essentially just a hue that you apply to the canvas that adds color, but it doesn't take away from line or value. So you're not changing really how dark or light anything is. You're not changing any of your details. You're just working a color into that painting. That's exactly what we're doing right now. It's making it look a lot more complex, isn't it? See that I'm being very loose with my brush strokes. You can also hold your brush at the back here and paint like this. That will make your applications look a lot more free, less stiff, if you find that's an issue you're having. If you find you're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again. But I'm generally trying to move in the direction of this, in the direction of this, in the direction of this, and they all just kind of move into one another with this very clear pigment. With that, we're definitely ready to start moving down more so in the painting. So I think here we're just going to continue with the second, more simplified step and continue adding those nice deep reds along the edge that then work themselves out. You can see that I'm also continuously remixing this color. I don't mix a massive amount of it at once, and I like to do this in a staggered approach because it gives us a lot of practice in mixing those pigments, making sure that we memorize it. That way the next time we want to find that color, we want to paint a similar scene, we have those ideas set in our head. We don't have to kind of figure out all of it again from scratch. It's something that's very well defined, and we can work with that. So, with that, as you can see, we are starting on that edge, and then we are working our way out. Now that this has started to dry a little bit, I'm going back to it, grabbing the edges, softening them, moving them in the directions that we want the space to move. This is slightly more orange than the last mixture that we had going on there. It's not an issue though. I do want this to be a bit more orange and a bit more bright. So as you're going, feel like you can make those minute changes. as long as you blend one into the other, and you just go back over that top one. There we go. Red, orange, a little bit of white, take off the excess, a little bit of black, take off the excess, work in some extra color. There we are. So, eventually this is going to blend with all of the color, the light that's emanating from that area. So we'll just start working that in. I want to blend this out, but I have too much paint on my brush right now to do so effectively. And I also want to blend this out, but I have too much paint to do so effectively. So I'm going to find other areas that can take a lot of paint that will require it. I'm going to apply it to those, and then once the paint on my brush really dissipates, then I can go back to the areas that I wanted to incorporate those subtle blends. So I'm using the remainder of the paint not to finish those areas right now, but to go back and finish other areas that I do think are important. There we go. You can see that here we have essentially a line and a line. This has this really interesting curved motion. Here we have a bit of a V going on. It's always evolving, always changing. Here I'm creating that motion, that swipe in between these two. And as you can see, I'm almost out of paint on my brush, which is great because it means we can go back to this and start blending that out. Now I am applying a little bit more pressure just so that I can move this now semi-dried paint around. But that's okay because here is an area where brush strokes really aren't an issue. Sometimes when you're creating that soft gradient like the background, you want to avoid any and all pressure with your brush, right? But in areas where brush strokes are welcome, then it's not a bad thing at all. Here, I'm almost grinding the brush into the canvas. And while I do want some movement, I am using the edge of my brush to give us a bit more of a soft look for this background base, which we can add detail on top of after. There we go. So we have this essentially established abstract look going on at this point, right? It's pretty neat. It's different. It doesn't really look like space yet, and that's okay. We're probably getting close to half an hour into the lesson, and I just want that to act as a reminder to you that when you're painting these things, patience so important. We don't expect the first layer to look absolutely incredible. We work towards it. If you want, you can skip ahead to the end of the painting, see exactly how it turns out, and just know that we're working towards something that's going to be quite nice, quite successful. Here I'm going over some of those previous applications, building up some additional textures and highlights. Trying to apply the brush on different angles to keep it diverse and interesting. Now I'm going to grab a lot of water, make this a bit more red, so it's semi-transparent, and grab a little bit more water. And this is where we do what is again almost a wash. So we take this incredibly thin paint, this very wet brush, and we just fill out more of those motions that we've created in our properly established miniature subjects here, right? We can also make it quite soft in areas, and I will do that. Working in that circular motion with the little amounts of pressure, it's a great way of achieving that soft look, like we did in the background. Like I'm doing right here. If you look at this in comparison to this, it's quite a big difference. This again, done with lots of little strokes and drags. This was done with the side of the brush and this rounded movement. So, different ways of going about it for different techniques. With that, I do want slightly more red as you move up. I want it to be soft as well. And I know we are just about moving off the camera, so I think I'm just going to finish this area up really quickly like this, and then we'll move back down into this corner. After that, we'll start adding some detail to this and start making it look a little bit better. Now, this bottom right corner here, it's really quite interesting. If we look on the photo, you can see that it's a bunch of little blotchy effects, all of these more circular shapes of different sizes that are amalgamated together, sometimes layered on top of one another, and we're going to focus really well on that technique. Obviously, in the reference photo, you have a lot of stars on top to kind of distract from it, but when you're working with these things, you want to look for the general hues, the general bodies of color, articulate where they are, what they are, and then once you've accomplished that, you can add the details like the stars and all of those fun things on top. With that, I know I want this to be relatively watery, so I grabbed some extra water. I know that I'm going to want one of them right down here, and I know I want it to be more red. So let's grab some extra red. Let's make sure it's watery yet again. Yeah. And then I'll create some of these splotchy effects. I'm going to hold the brush like this because I tried doing that as two different shapes and then they ended up being the same. This is going to make it harder to paint, but it's going to relinquish a lot of the control I had. I'm going to follow the reference photo, but I'm going to let the freedom of the stroke take over as well. Going to soften some edges. Using the side of my brush. Blend it into previously applied areas because we did change the color a little bit. We don't want essentially the color to start and then stop. We want it to move in a flowing manner. There we are. So far, so good. Need some really watery areas for here because I don't want this to be too complicated. We already have a complicated area here. We have a complicated area here. This spot, I want it to be a bit more subdued. That way, the eye can take a bit of a visual break and focus on the areas where you really want it to. If everything is hyper detailed, then nothing stands out. You need areas of calm to balance areas of complexity. Now we can make a little bit more. We'll probably use slightly more titanium white in this mixture than we did the last, or just less Mars black. We want something slightly lighter than our previous application. And we're just going to build some highlighted areas. So I'm going over into the middle of some of the more circular bodies. There we go. But, of course, that is very, very high contrast. We don't want that. So now we go back, work in these circular shapes. If we waited a little bit longer for that to dry a bit more, we wouldn't be moving around so much of this. And it would look more subtle, but that's, again, just a good lesson and something to consider when you're working in these ways. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with how this is turning out. You can also use water to take paint off as you can see there. We're getting these really great effects. Just like that. It's also worth noting that this area right here is very wet, and when acrylics are wet, they look reflective, they look shiny, and the darks are going to look a little bit dark, so you can see that that dark looks darker than all of the other black, despite the fact that it can't be because we didn't use a darker pigment, and so it can be a bit deceiving. Recognize that when the painting is wet, reflections do have a big impact visually on it, and if you kind of start saying, okay, you know, I need to change this area to look like this area, this looks more saturated, make that area saturated. You probably make that too saturated because this area isn't actually that saturated right now. It's just reflective, and that's making it look more so. So if you ever get in any of those scenarios where you're looking at one new area that you're currently painting that's very wet in another area and you say, oh, you know, I should go back and change that, wait till that new area is dry. It's going to give you a much more realistic representation, an idea of how everything is cohesively working together. With that, I'm quite happy there, so I am going to let that dry. We're going to move back, look at it as a whole, and then we'll start adding details and, again, making these secondary areas, using the second technique, a bit more cohesive with the top, where we use the first technique of multiple colors initially, where this is essentially a single color that is comprised of two colors. I hope that makes sense. Now, as we step back, we can see the difference between the first technique and the second technique. This one already has a couple of colors implemented. This highlight is definitely stronger than anything we have down here, and this is definitely more dynamic than what we've established. But we can take those effects, all of those different highlights and hues, and interject them down here into our base. So for this, we're going to be working with those same colors that we have on our palette. Grab a little bit of our orange, a little bit of our red, and by the way, I am working with a slightly smaller round pointed brush. This one's about 1/8 of an inch. Just wanted something a little bit more detailed now that we have those larger areas blocked in. Now here, again, we do want to match kind of how bright, how saturated that is. So I am working with a bit more of the orange rather than the red, and a bit more titanium white rather than the Mars black. From here, we are going to continue working on the edge, add in those highlights, and we're probably not going to do this for all of it, but we'll do it for a fair portion, especially in the areas that are quite large like this one. From there, the same general rules are going to apply. We're going to start working that pigment out and ensure that we have some of those nice movements and textures. Going to want our pigment to be fairly watery. If this is semi-transparent and you can still see those initial reds through it, it'll be more diverse. It'll be more difficult to initially decipher, which will keep the viewer's eye on the painting for a longer period of time and is actually quite beneficial for your painting's longevity in the idea in the mind of the viewer. So we are trying to keep it relatively thin. Just going to grab some more water right now, actually, before applying this pigment. There we go. And again, very much liking the process here. It's a lot of fun, it's cathartic. It's one of those things where you can't really get wrong because it's space, right? It's just so visually abstract that you have a lot of room to play and have fun with it, make it your own, work with the colors that you want. You know, you could just be using blues for this rather than the oranges and the reds. You'd be using purples and greens. There's so much option. And I think that's what makes it so much fun. Go. We'll come back here, we'll start moving those highlights out a little bit. But just like that, we are very quickly establishing something more. Because we're using a lot of titanium white, we are losing saturation to a point, but I am going to show you how we're reincorporating that in a little bit. Not something to worry about. With a glaze on a dry application, we'll get all of it right back. That said, I do think I want more red up in the top right. So we'll just work that together here. It's a nice dark red. Going to hold my brush differently again, just ensure that we're consistently getting something different. And I'm doing these relatively long drags, they're about 1 centimeter long, so that we get not a patchy effect, but one that has more dynamic movement. There we go. So far so good. The next step is going to be to let all of this dry, then we'll go in with a glaze. We don't want to do the glaze right now because the glaze has a lot of water on the brush, and if we were to do so, we'd probably rip off a lot of the paint that we just applied that hasn't fully dried and settled yet. If you apply a lot of water to a recently applied pigment, even if it's been drying for 2 minutes, it's probably going to take it right off the canvas, combine it with that water, and we don't want that. We like our new highlights and that new color diversity that we've just been able to install, and we want to keep that for the next step. So we want to ensure that it is fully dry, and then together we will work on that new glaze. So here we are a little closer to the canvas, and as you can see we have a lot of really neat color diversity in here, different reds, oranges, all of that, but it might be a little bit too much. We might also have a slightly more contrast in there through here than we want. So what we can do if we want to unify things, if we want to kind of bring it all together, is we can take a damp brush. This one again is the 1-inch flat-headed, and I'm going to take a little bit of our cadmium red light hue, a little bit of our cadmium red, put those two together and add a lot of water to this mixture to the point where it's essentially like painting with watercolor. Then we can just go all the way over our image and apply this very thin layer of red, which is going to tie more of it together. You don't have to do this. This is really just if you feel through that process of diversifying that you kind of got a little bit carried away, made things a little too different, not cohesive. And this is a very easy way of just slowly adding in additional color to the point where it all looks like a single cohesive unit. I know we're using the word cohesive a lot, but it's really the best word to use in these scenarios. And as you can see, we're even starting to add some of that warmer hue to these darker areas that were initially negative space. Using a lot of water so that we add this up incredibly slowly, but eventually we do get there. We can also do that with our Mars Black. If we want to darken something, we can use a little bit of titanium white if we feel it's too saturated, but I don't feel like we're at that point. There we go. Really liking this so far. It's also really neat to see right up here, you have the Conte, we have some water, and the Conte is essentially gone. We moved that off the canvas, and now you just kind of have the reflections showing through. When that dries, it'll look completely normal. We're also moving a little bit of this orange out into it, which won't be bad for our next layer. With that, I am going to let this dry, and then yet again, we'll proceed together into the next color. So stepping back, we can see the effects of our glazing, and I really do feel like it brought the piece together. With that, we are now ready to move on to the next step, and that is going to be this larger, more so yellow area. I am going to be moving back to the round pointed brush. This one is about 1/4 inch, so it's the larger of the two, and we're going to start working with a new color, that being Naples yellow. Now I'm going to move this down to a new spot on my palette. I'm going to grab some titanium white, mix them about half and half, and these are both great pigments because they're very thick and they'll cover the Mars black quite well. That said, we are definitely going to have to do multiple layers with this pigment, so just recognize that regardless of what pigment we're using, that's still going to be a part of the acrylic painting process. It's also worth noting that, again, different acrylic paints have different opacities innately, and things like your cadmium reds, your primary yellows, cerulean blue, they're all relatively thin pigments because they're predominantly made of hue, but your Mars blacks, your titanium whites, they're much more thick and you don't need to do as many layers with them generally. So this, despite the fact that it is a bit more thick, you can still see that black showing through, and we'll definitely have to do quite a bit of layering here, but that's okay. It'll just make us a better painter, and it'll be quite fun. That said, I'm going to move you a lot closer. That way you can see just how thick this pigment is and how the additional layers make a massive difference. So here we are, yet again, quite a bit closer, grabbing some of that Naples yellow, titanium white, doing a good mix here, and then we'll come back and start covering some of those previous applications. You can see a little bit of the brush stroke through this, and you will continue to for the first probably 3 or 4 layers with this pigment because the background is so dark and this pigment is so light. We could get away with a lot of the darker pigment showing through with the reds and the oranges, but this is not one of those where we're going to have that lenient ability. So, just going to have some fun and continue the process. It's also worth noting that we're using a Naples yellow here specifically because it's much more subdued. And if we were to apply a primary yellow or a cadmium yellow on top of the black with some titanium white, despite the fact that the Mars black is fully dry, we would get a green. Because yellow and black generally equate to a green, and while they're not physically blending, they are optically blending. You're still seeing the black through the yellow, so we want something like this, which is hyper desaturated, that won't let us fall into that issue. I'm now switching, by the way, to the 1-inch flat-headed brush that we've used a couple of times in this lesson. It's amazing just how many uses a single brush can have, but I'm mixing up quite a bit more of this paint, going in with some nice thick layers, and I'm going to use this because it's going to let me do some larger strokes and blends. We have quite an area here to cover, and this is very much going to help us do that. There we go. We want it to be the most yellow, kind of near the edges, and then as we get towards the middle here, things start to change. Going to take the majority of that pigment off my brush. We're going to grab maybe a little bit of our cadmium red, not our cadmium red light hue, because I want to blend this into the blue here eventually. I'm just not quite ready for it. So we'll grab some of that red, we'll move that to a new spot on our palette, we'll grab some white. This will, of course, make more of a pink than anything. And that's what we're going to transition this into. Because the pink will transition much better into the blue than what the yellow would. There we go. And now you can see that I'm slowly moving it out, letting it dissipate, using a very watery brush to do so. Getting this very natural gradient of transparency, very opaque, to not opaque. And I'm going to move the camera back so that you can see what I'm doing a little bit higher up as well. Now at this point, I think it's quite evident that the painting isn't looking its best. It's looking very messy, and it's going to enter stages where it does look very messy. This is quite natural for the painting process. And it's okay, don't get discouraged. Recognize that these steps have to happen. And we are going to bring this back to a place of being really nice and much better than before. So here I'm essentially just using the little bit of paint left on my brush with a lot of water on my brush. I'm moving out the edges. You can see I'm also moving my brush in a circular stroke. Just like that. To move a lot of this out. There we go. Just trying to get things to look nice and consistent, and I'm consistently going over it so that I'm lessening the amount of that circular shape you actually see. The point of the circular shape isn't to create something that looks circular, and it isn't to create a visual repetition, but rather to smooth things out. And it's the easiest motion to get things consistently smooth. So the longer we do this, as you can see, the less brush strokes that are noticeable, especially as the paint dries here. There's still some real brush strokes in this area right here, but that is something we will work with over time. I'm going to grab a bit more of that pink. I know I want it right up here. Moving it down into this. And yet again, you can see what this used to look like, right? I think we'll grab a bit more pigment. Red and white. There we go. Just going to put a little bit of this in the middle. That way we have some extra paint to work with. Going to take all of that pigment off my brush because I don't want to use any more. Going to make the brush damp at this point. We already have a lot of water on the canvas. I don't think we need any more. And judging that is something that's going to kind of take time. Figuring out those right amounts, that consistency on the canvas, just kind of innately. But you will get there. So here yet again, working in their circular shapes. Now I'm going to have a lot of blue right here, so I can do a little bit of a blend over into it, but I don't want to overdo it. You can see we're slowly covering up all of that Mars black pigment. Starting to look relatively decent. Still have a long way to go with the painting as a whole, but this technique in itself is starting to work. This nice damp brush. All of the pigment is still slightly wet, but it is starting to dry, and I'm trying to do this almost until it's fully dry. There's going to become a point where this effect isn't going to help anymore, but I'm continuing it almost until I get to that point. It's looking really beautiful though. Excellent. Okay, very, very happy with that. Definitely have that real space effect up in this area of the painting. And you know what? That's a third way you can go about these areas. We'll just mix up a little bit of a reddish pink. We'll put that here. Just trying to show you as much as I possibly can in this lesson. Generally with these, I try to show you how to get to an end result, but I also really want it to be a lesson where you can take what you've learned here and you can incorporate it in your own pieces. You can kind of put it away so that someday, should you want to render something else like this, you can do that. You have the skills. You understand not only how to do things, but you understand why you're doing things, and then how to implement them in different ways. So again, we're painting this background, but we're doing so at this point in 3 different ways. That way you have some option. I think that we all have personal preference one way or another as well. And now you can kind of cater to whatever yours is. But there we have some really nice orange. I like that a lot. I think that's neat. Have that blend just a little bit at the top. I am going to want a bit of a almost lightning-esque strike happening in between the two of them. We'll create this little bit of a glow. So I'm taking this orangish red that we were using for this, and I'm just mapping the edge of that highlight on both sides. Looking good. Looking really good. Add a bit more red up here just so it's slightly more cohesive. Clean it up. And that's something I'll go back to a number of times as well. Took a while to build that. It'll take a little while to build that. And that's just part of the process. With that, we definitely do need to do a bit more work in here. So we'll grab some extra yellow, some extra white. Again, those initial layers weren't quite enough. And you want to wait until they're fully dry to reapply this, otherwise it can peel up paint, and you can see that happening very in a small amount right here. I'll get you a lot closer so you can see exactly what it is and what to avoid. So, if you look really closely, right here we have thick paint. You can almost see no Mars Black showing through, but then right here, this little area, you can actually see more of that Mars Black paint, and that's because the amount of water and paint on my brush are essentially just ripping off the paint at this point, and I can't add any more to that area. It's a little bit too wet. So, if you're working with a very wet canvas, which will happen if you're doing a lot of glazing and whatnot, sometimes if you want to apply a thick pigment, you have to wait for it to fully dry to go back in and re-add that new thick, very prominent opaque color. So, that's kind of the issue we're running into there, and it's a good reminder that, you know what, sometimes we do need to take these breaks and move on to other things while that happens. So I'm going to do a couple of things. The first is I'm going to just soften my edge here a little bit between both, and then I'm also going to go get a drink and stay hydrated. I've been painting for a while now. I think a lot of us in the art community, it's very easy to forget to eat. It's very easy to forget to drink. You just get so wrapped up in the artwork and what you're making, which is wonderful to feel that passionate about something, right? But it's also important that we stay healthy, stay hydrated. It'll help you do better in the long run. So, I'm going to stop my almost impulsive need to continue painting right now. And instead, I'm going to go get some water. I would implore you to do the same. And by that time, that should be dry. We can come back and we can continue working on it together. So, as an update, it's been a couple of minutes. We have rehydrated and this area is now fully dry. So, we're going to grab some more of our Naples yellow, some titanium white, and here I am using the round pointed brush, the one that is 1/4 of an inch, and that's because I don't need to do a massive area right here. I want to keep this a bit more precise, and we can move back to the larger brush should we feel we need to. So here I'm working my edges first, and as a general rule, I love to work the edges first because that's when you have the most new, very easily applicable paint, and the longer you apply that paint, the more it dissipates on the brush. So you essentially lose it as you go, and you just want to ensure that in the beginning, when you're doing those very specific sharp applications, that you have the ability to do so. Here, I am starting to lose it, and that means that covering this area will be a little bit more difficult, but I wasn't going to be able to do so in a single layer anyway, and now that I don't have much paint left on my brush, I can switch to holding it like this, work in that circular shape with the brush, and blend that yellow out, just getting a very, very soft look. That's exactly what we want. So far so good there. Definitely need to do another layer, but we can also take this, and something, I have the reference photo tape here, something else we can do is we can test directly on a reference photo. This is something I love to do if I'm ever questioning a color, and it looks like we are actually right on track. So we got kind of lucky. I didn't test beforehand, probably should have, but you know, we were able to do what we needed to do. And now that I know that I actually really do love this color, I'm going to start working it into these areas just a little bit, not too much, just in a couple spots here and there. That way we have a nice transition from the reds into this very bright Naples yellow glow. Might also create a couple little moving, almost, branches of light in the same way we did these through here. You don't have to do this, it's an extra detail. It will visually complicate the scene. Recognize that. You're not going to want to do all of the techniques I do, so just kind of find the ones that you really enjoy, work with those, and make the piece that you really want. I'm going to use some water here, soften this a little bit. I'm going to use my finger. And finger painting, still an amazing technique. Big fan, always have been. But be aware that your fingertips do have oil on them, and sometimes when you do that, you apply X amount of oil to the canvas, and the water from your brush and the paint can't go over that area once it has that oil on it. So if you are going to do that, make sure that your hands are very clean and have been right before you go into that process, because you don't want to create an area that you can't actually apply paint on top of. Just a little pro tip for all of you finger painters out there. That said, if you do get to that point, just let it dry completely and then apply some thick paint over it, and then you'll be able to work on that area again if that mistake does happen, because I know it still happens to me. It's just one of those things where, you get used to the technique, and then all of a sudden you apply and it's, oh, I didn't wash my hands. This is a little bit of an issue. That said, right now I feel like everybody's probably very much in the habit of washing their hands, as we should be. And so, you know what, now's a great time to experiment with finger painting. With that, here I am going back into this area yet again, using a bit more paint. Still not perfect, but it's certainly getting better. Every time we do that, it looks a little bit better, and that's, at this point, very much the goal. I'm also, while we wait for that to dry, I'm going to take some of our Naples yellow, cadmium red light hue, mix these two together. I'm going to mix a bit more because they're both relatively thin. There we go. And here we'll create a nice edging that we can occasionally move out into the orange. I want the values to be a little bit closer. I want the hues to be a little bit closer. So far, so good. It's also adding volume. It's adding depth to the red. Working in a circle for a nice blend. Then moving it down a couple of very distinct ways. I'm also moving it over the glow a little bit too. There we go. Now, this next step really is going to be going over this maybe 2, maybe 3 more times. So I'm going to do that myself off camera, get that all cleaned up, and then together we'll work into the next step, which will be very much defining this. In the process of doing that, I realized that I should probably wait until this is exactly how I want, because this may impact how bright the edges, and then we may have to change all of it. So it's important to kind of prioritize certain parts of your painting to make the process as easy as possible. Acrylics, they are very forgiving, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a great approachable medium. If you mess up, it's fine. You can just cover it up and you can repaint again in 10 minutes, right? But we can make things a little bit easier by prioritizing certain layers, and that's what we're going to do here. So I'm going to finish this up, then we'll work on some details through here together. So I've gone ahead and did a couple of additional layers there. It's looking nice and thick, so we can continue working with the oranges that we have on the edge. And I'm going to want this to feel like it flows one into the other, but this obviously being a lot brighter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some of the cadmium red light hue, I'm going to take a little bit of our Naples yellow, mix up a nice, slightly brighter orange variant, and I'll apply that initially right to this side using the round pointed brush so I can get a little bit of a blend happening partially on top of that brighter highlight, so it's a bit of a less sharp transition. It's a bit softer here. We can use our finger to soften it further. We just want something a bit less separating. I'm also brightening up portions of this. We have lots of water on our brush, so I'm not really disturbing all of those small little details. We can do a bit of a glaze if we want to further progress that, if we feel it might be a little too stark with what we have over on the right. And then this next step is going to be really fun. We're going to take what we have, we're going to incorporate some extra yellow, some extra white, quite a bit of each, a little bit of orange, more yellow, create a good healthy mix, give it slightly more saturation, slightly more orange, there we go. Now, we're essentially going to have this, again, look a little bit like lightning. So I'm going to go on the opposite side of it, and I'm going to start incorporating some of this color. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take all of that extra pigment off our brush. I'm going to go to the left-hand side of it, and we're going to create a very soft blend outwards. There we go. And again, with this slightly more bottom piece. So far so good. It's incredibly subtle. Nice start. Let's add a hint of cadmium red this time. This has slightly more color than the last mixture. Let's go to that edge. You can see I'm skipping that little area right there. I'm going to take that pigment off our brush as we did last time. And then we start softening that edge. Using the side of our brush. This is something you're going to want to build up over time. We don't have it going out too far, but a little bit. There we go. Get a bit more. You can see we're just slowly building this. I don't think I'm going to make anything else as dark as this current area right here, but I like it for the contrast. It does let you notice that there is a little bit of a separation happening throughout. Very light taps, letting some brush strokes show through, but not too many. There we go. Really neat. Now we'll switch over to the smaller round point brush, the one that is about 1/8 of an inch rather than 1/4 of an inch. We'll mix up some of that very bright pigment that we used for the middle, though we'll make it a little bit more white. Create that very defining line. I'm using the pinky to steady my hand so that I don't have a lot of shake, and I can apply this with a lot more confidence and just ensure that all of those applications are exactly how we want them. Then I'm also going to move them out into here in a couple of spots. We'll move that out. Again, now we're getting into some of the interesting details. Move it through here. Like I noted, pre-stars, this is all going to look very abstract. But it's also nice to kind of simultaneously learn how to paint abstract pieces too, isn't it? I think we could use a little bit more of our yellow for this. We can soften edges if we want. But so far, so good. Now, for the first time, we are going to start working with an ultramarine blue. I believe this is actually a French ultramarine blue, but ultramarine blue is just fine. I am switching back to the 1-inch flat-headed brush. We're making sure it's nice and damp, and we're going to mix up a lighter blue. So I'll just move this down here on my palette, grab some titanium white, mix that up. We'll grab a little bit of Mars black. And the majority of the Mars black has dried here on my palette. Underneath it is still a bit wet, but I often get the question of how I keep the colors on my palette wet for these longer painting sessions, and the honest answer is I don't. I use as much as I can, and then occasionally some of it just dries. But I'd often much prefer to have more on my palette, just in case I need it in a time where everything's just kind of drying. It means that occasionally you will kind of let some of it go to waste, but I think often the painting is better for it. I also think that when we're just starting painting, it's something that we're not too happy about because, of course, we just invested in all of these different pigments and we want to be able to use as much of them as possible. But after you do that, all of your investments are going to be significantly less because you're going to have all of these other colors stockpiled, and then you won't feel too hesitant about having those pigments like that. With that, I'm now going to test this color on my reference photo, just make sure it is in fact what we want, and you know what? I actually want it to be a lot brighter. So I'm going to take that pigment off my brush, we'll try again, take some of our ultramarine blue, some of our titanium white, mix those two together, just like that. Now I'm going to test that on my reference photo, just have it taped above my canvas so when I step back I can kind of see them against each other. And yet again, I want it brighter, so more titanium white. There we go. Do still want a hint of Mars black just so it isn't fully a single color. Test that. And that is really nice. So now that we finally have it, I know that I want it here, and then I want it here. I'm going to start right up here because it's an easier area to fix if I feel like I want to. So I'll start by just applying a little bit of pigment, like that. Maybe a little bit right here. It does end up moving down into this area, and then a little bit right there. So, not too much. Going to take all of that pigment off my brush now. Make sure my brush is nice and damp. And here is where we get back to that swirling effect. There we go. You can see just how far you can stretch it with the water. Keeps it wet for a much longer period of time. Such a fantastic resource and technique. So here we go again, working in those circles, expanding outwards. I think we'll cover the entirety of this area. And we'll even blend it over into our previously applied circular applications to make it look nice and cohesive. But we're trying to keep the majority of our color in the areas that we initially applied it. Grab a little bit more, say, okay, you know what, I know I want it here. We'll increase the amount we have. It'll be really easy to blend out because this area of the canvas is pretty wet. I think that worked out well. Now I know that we want some down here. It's a little bit harder to move around because the brush is starting to run out of water, but I think we were able to have enough in there to apply that quite nicely for the first application at least. Now we're going to make our brush wet again, grab some extra pigment, and I know I want some of that blue right up here. I do have too much water on my brush right now, and I can tell because I don't have enough thick pigment to move around. So we just took some water off, added some more pigment. We can even blend over the red. You might optically make a bit of a purple, which isn't a bad color, not at all. This actually kind of pushed that back. We can use our finger to take it off if we want, or if we want a really smooth blend, we can take one of the smaller round pointed brushes, grab a little bit of our Cad Red. You probably want to stick to your cadmium red rather than cadmium red light here for this, because it will actually blend better with the blue. But here we can just create some really nice applications as it will blend with the blue. Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. So much so that I'm going to continue to move it over here. There we go. That's really nice. Okay, so once that's done, we're going to move back to this brush. We need to mix some more paint. Blue and white. Just like that. I'll add more blue here. I know that I do want more blue right here. And I think I want more blue. Do I want more blue right here? You know what? I don't think I do. I think we'll create a third application, a third spot somewhere though. Right here. Yeah. Okay. So once again, take all of that paint off my brush. And we work in those circular motions. Oh, but here, this is really interesting. You can see that the paint actually, or all of the water, ripped the paint off the canvas. That is something that does happen if it gets too wet. So we're just going to smooth out all of the other areas. I'm actually glad this happened. It'll be a really good lesson. So we're just going to smooth out all of the other areas around it, make them look as nice as we can, and then once all of this is dry and fully dry, we can go back and fully cover that with a nice thick pigment, and we'll have a much easier time applying that. This is why you don't want to do too many glazes too quickly, but if you let it dry fully, that won't happen. So this was entirely a repercussion of kind of moving through things a little bit too quickly, and I can actually tell that it's happening right here with this one as well. So we have a couple of options. We could let that dry exactly as is, or we can just do the blend as best we can and accept that we're going to go back in. You know what? That worked out pretty well. So now we are definitely going to take a break with those portions of the painting, and I'd also like to have a little conversation, I suppose, while we do. With acrylics, there's an opinion that you shouldn't use water because eventually it will flake off portions of your acrylic paintings. And this is something I've heard for 15 years, and I've painted with water on acrylic and canvas for, all of that time. Never has it happened to me. Never has it happened to any of the other professional artists I know, and I really do not feel it's something you ever need to worry about. The only issue that I feel water can present, and this is something that other acrylic thinning mediums also present, is that occasionally a little bit of your paint can get ripped up if you're working with a little bit too much water consistently. But again, it's very easily remediable. We just wait for it to dry, cover it with some thick paint, and we're good to go. Or if we find that, it is really getting wet, we just stop. We take again 5-10 minute break, come back into it, and then we can continue glazing without fear or worry about that. So I'm a big believer in working with water and acrylics. It's how we've gotten this far. It's how we're going to bring this to fruition and make something really special. So really don't worry about it, especially with these techniques. So with that, we are going to let that dry, and then I guess I will see you in just a minute. So it's actually been about 15 minutes. I wanted to let it dry significantly more than I had in the past, and now we're going to go in with a brush, the round pointed brush, using the edge going into that center. I don't have a lot of water on this brush right now, and that's because I just want the very opaque, thick applications. Currently taking the rest of the pigment off my brush, and now I'm going to dry it as well as I possibly can. We're going to go into that edge. We're going to do that rounded effect, softening everything, and bringing that to a really nice look. Just like that. That said, these two are very visually similar, and when I look at the reference photo, I can tell that this one actually moves down. It has a bit more of a flow rather than a circle, so I'm going to do exactly that. I know that I need more highlight up here that's going to move down into here. I'm going to move that circular stroke around, softening everything. And that is looking really, really nice. Definitely a step in the right direction. I think I'll actually test this on the reference photo. Yeah, I think we could make it slightly brighter. There we go. Oh, kind of blocking that with my hand. Sorry about that. That said, I do know that I am currently using the reference photo a lot. I think it's worth noting that you don't really need to use a reference photo. It's something that can be helpful. It gives you ideas, and it kind of allows you to step outside of the box of your general aesthetic comfort zones. I think when a lot of us paint from our imaginations, we essentially go and we draw from what we learned when we were younger and we were watching cartoons. And it's a very nostalgic thing. It's a very deep-seated thing, but it's one of those things that is subconscious, and we do it, but we don't really realize. And an issue with that is that for a lot of us, those ideas of what subjects look like are very simplified because they are based around cartoons or comics or all of these different things that we experience when we are a lot younger, right? So the reference photos, they allow us to continue to elaborate in ways that we wouldn't have thought of naturally. And that's kind of what I'm using this for here. I've done a lot of space scenes. I know the general techniques, but it's helping me ensure that all of my space scenes don't look the same and that we're progressively moving in new and interesting directions. The fact that we didn't end up with two circles here and that this is now moving very much speaks to that. So not a necessary thing at all, but something that can help you further elaborate on paintings, especially when you feel like yours are starting to look a little visually samey. That noted, of course, again, you can find the traceable and the reference photo up over on the Patreon, just like you can with all of the other lessons. And up there, you can also find access to all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners. In there, we talk about everything you need to know jumping into your first acrylic painting. We talk about glazing, what brushes to use, how to mix colors, how to work with water, composition. Really, again, just a very comprehensive guide on what you need to know jumping into your first acrylic painting. We also have a lot of ebooks full of traceables for those uninspired days you want to make something but you're not entirely sure what that is. You can just look in there. Some of them even have reference photos. We have some on flowers, landscapes. It's a lot of fun things. And also worth noting, up there you can also gain access to our exclusive Facebook group where we all share our artwork, help each other out, and it's just a great, very positive artistic community where you get to see all these different renditions of these lessons, how people are making them their own, getting really creative, using different techniques and mediums. So if you're interested in the ebooks, the traceables, the reference photos, the Facebook group, any of that, you can find that over on Patreon, link in the description. And as per usual, I'd like to say a massive, massive thank you to everybody who is already up over on Patreon. It is because of you that we were able to do these longer lessons, that it's not just another like speed painting on YouTube. I know there are a lot of those, and they're a lot easier, they're a lot quicker to make. But I really try to make these as informative as I can. I try to do color tests beforehand, try to do miniature versions just to ensure that we can teach it in the best way possible. And again, I am able to put that time in because of you, because of your support. So thank you for providing that, for making these lessons happen. it's a pretty wonderful thing to be able to teach art, to be able to make art for a living. And you provide that opportunity to me, and in a way you provide these lessons for everybody else watching these at home. So thank you for doing all that you do. It's more than you know, and very much appreciate it. With that, we are just about coming to the end of what we need to do here for the blue in the sky. I don't want to overdo it, but I do like this quite a lot. I can do a couple little taps in here. They might look like stars later on, and if there's a specific star with the blue that you want, a specific area, you can just tap that in right now. We're going to apply stars in 3 different ways, but we can definitely get started and just kind of get a feel for how we want to balance them compositionally. So you can see that I'm tapping in a couple of them here and there. It's not going to be many, because this application is going to render a star that's actually a little bit large. We're using the tip of the brush, but it's still a myriad of the bristles touching the canvas. And we need to be careful with that, because we can make them a lot smaller. We can add a lot more detail and depth through these smaller stars, and we just don't want to overdo it at this point and make them all visually samey by creating all these stars of these equal sizes. So I'm just incorporating a couple that I think will aid the composition, that I know I want in there, and then from there we will move on to the next step. But for that next step, we do need the entirety of our blue and our stars to dry. So we're going to take another probably 15-minute break just to be extremely safe, and then we'll jump right back into it. Also, the blue stars, they can go out into these red areas, even on top of and behind. Don't feel like it's limited to this right here. Have fun with it, and make sure that it feels like a whole. So from here, we're going to switch to the round pointed brush. This one again is about 1/4 of an inch, and we're going to use the rounded technique to continue moving some of this pink outwards. Now, to kind of show you what I'm talking about, if we do get the reference photo out again, you can see that it moves up right through here in between a lot of the blue, and that's really our big goal. I'm going to take some titanium white, and I'm also going to take some of our cadmium red medium hue, not too much. I want it to be a very subtle pink, so I'll use a lot more white than I will red, and I'll just mix that up right down here. Now, if I were to apply this with its regular consistency, probably be too difficult to move on the canvas, so I'm actually going to make my brush a little bit more damp. I don't want it to be fully wet. I do still want to be able to do a couple layers here, so we're really looking for that middle kind of amount of water. And I'm going to start just right outside of this highlight, work in these circular motions, blend it back into the previously applied highlight and outwards as well. Trying to do this from a bit of a distance right now, just so that I can watch the highlights in the entirety of the painting at once, rather than kind of doing a little too much in one area. Now, because I didn't have enough water on my brush, that area wasn't able to move as much as I wanted it to. So we'll just grab a little bit more. Now we're able to work into it, work upwards. Trying to be fairly soft, but if the paint starts to dry, then I might instigate slightly more pressure. Just help us move that about. I think it's time for some additional paint. Again, I like to start with a minimal amount just because we're not always entirely sure if we have the right color from the beginning. And I also wanted to make it slightly more pink. So with the second mix, we did make that change. Had we mixed a massive amount initially, probably wouldn't have been able to do this with any real ease. We would have had to use significantly more paint, probably gone back a couple of times. And so far I think it's looking quite good. Though I do want to test my pink on the reference photo, and we are actually right on track. I love that. Getting pretty lucky with this one. That said, the longer you do this, the easier it'll get to kind of just look at colors and then match them to other colors you create. Really is something that takes time though. I think that with the painting process, I definitely felt much more confident with just about everything else, excluding color. And then color was kind of that last thing that really clicked for me, and the ability to just kind of look at something and recognize how it's kind of composed, if that makes any sense. Here we go. We are again taking this slow, and another reason we are taking this slow is because we're applying a fairly light value to the painting, right? Over areas that were previously fairly dark. And that means we're adding to more of the brightness. Eventually, if we continue doing this through the entirety of it, we take out all of the dark and we essentially take out the contrast. Nothing really pops at that point. So we're trying to ensure that we're not doing that we are progressively adding this in a way that keeps the painting balanced with its lights and its darks. And again, that's another reason why, for the most part, I am painting this at a real distance. I'm holding the brush a bit farther away. I'm trying to kind of move my neck back a little bit, just so I can get as wide of a perspective as I possibly can. Here we go, blending back into those previous applications. If you do use a lot of water in this process, again, try to recognize that it may get to the point where you just can't work with it. It might start stripping that paint off only while it's wet, and then at that point you let it dry. Again, 5, 10, 15 minutes if you want to be extra safe, and the timing does change depending upon your location, but it's a good general rule. Now I have a bit more paint on my brush than I actually want, so I'm just going to apply it in a couple of areas that I know that I want it. And then I'll take this paint off my brush, and then I'll do the blending from there. So you can see right now we're just working with some rough lines, taking that paint off, making the brush a bit more dry because we have quite a bit of water already in the paint. And here comes the blend. The farther out you make your circular motion, the more it's going to blend it out, and you'll start to lose a little bit of color. So that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes you want that. Sometimes you want it to be more subtle, right? Very dependent on the situation. I can tell right here it's getting a little bit too wet to proceed in the way that I want to. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give it, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and then we'll hop back into it. We'll do some fine little details with that pink, and then we'll move on to the next step. But things are going really, really well. So we went ahead and let that dry. Now we're going in with a couple of different colors. We'll start here with some Mars Black and some of our Ultramarine Blue. Mix up a really nice dark mixture. Grab a hint of Titanium White. Don't want too much of it though, so we'll take off the excess and we'll blend those together. Now, we can find some of those darker areas around the pink, or areas that we want to be darker, and we can just instigate a little bit of detail just like that. We can add a little bit in here, maybe do a bit of a blend outwards. I'm essentially just looking for areas that are dark and adding in contrast, because we have this fairly nice background, but in the process of working in those circular applications with the pink and the blue, we essentially made that initially very dark value something that was a bit more soft and common. So I'm trying to reinstigate some of that contrast back in. I soften the edges, I blend it out into the pink, I blend it out into the blue. Try to make it look very natural in its setting. And I think it's working quite well. There we go. I like that a lot. This is definitely one of those techniques that you want to do a bit farther into the process, but when you start instigating it, it can look really, really fantastic. That said, you might do a little bit too much, slightly more than you actually intended to. And in that scenario, we just go back to the red, we go back to the white, mix those two up, and we say, okay, where could we brighten this up a little bit? Maybe you want this spot to be a bit brighter. Maybe you want it to move out into here again. Okay, that's a nice little expansion. Maybe we want to sharpen this line, give it some extra dimension. It's more prominent now. That's kind of nice. What if we moved this down into the pink as well? This is where we start taking some artistic liberties, looking at these abstract lines and movements, and just kind of asking ourselves how we want them to progress. Now that I have most of the paint off my brush, I can go back in and soften these things. Work more with those rounded motions, make them a bit less stark, but still visually leave them in there, right? There we go. I think that's turning out quite well. Taking a couple feet back, I suppose, in distance right now, and just kind of assessing it. I think that one thing I noticed that I don't love is that there's a very clean line right down here with dark, and I want to disrupt that minorly. I want to make it a little bit more visually complex, a little bit more visually interesting. So I'll add some pink, probably make it a bit more of a desaturated pink, despite the fact that for the most part we are working with more of red pink, but I want this to be a bit more subtle. So I'm going to find one of these lines that I already like, and I'm going to extend them, breaking this consistent flow. And I'm currently looking at doing this one, and we'll commit to it. There we go. So we no longer have that consistent line, but now we have this other very bright, very distinct line. And we can soften that again by using the edge of our brush, working in a very small area, so I know it might be difficult to see around the brush, and I do apologize for that. But it's a lot of the techniques that we've been previously working in. Nothing new, nothing too complicated here. There we go. I think that looks really, really nice. Might add slightly more of that highlight up here, defining that little shape. Maybe a bit more through here. We're essentially going to the middle of the pinks and just brightening them very, very softly. Even creating another small one down here, and I'll just take some of that contrast out. There we are. Okay, so far I think that is looking really, really good. Let's take a couple steps back and give it a good look. So after taking a step back here, I think what instantly becomes very apparent is the balance in the painting and how we finally achieved it with all of that added detail right up here. Because for a long time there, we had a lot of detail in this area, but this almost half of the painting was essentially void of it. We had a lot of very soft applications. And now that we have some line work, some of these very interesting, again, almost abstract movements, we have an area that balances this. We don't have all of the detail in one half, and now the eye can move much more freely, and it doesn't get bored in certain areas or feel overwhelmed when it's over here, because again, there's something just a little bit farther off to keep it entertained a little bit more subconsciously and recognize that all of that focus doesn't just need to be right in here. It's a good reminder that when you're planning your painting and your composition, you don't want every area of it to be hyper detailed. You don't want every area of it to be plain or boring. You want areas where the eye can visually rest, like right here or right here, right here. You want areas that really instigate movement, like what we have in here, here, and here. So we found a good balance. It's no longer everything at the top, everything at the bottom. It's a good eclectic mix, and that's really what we were aiming for with that top area. With that, we are now just going to do some little touch-ups, and I think I'm going to start by grabbing some red, some titanium white, mixing up a nice pinkish red here, grabbing just the smallest amount of paint, And I'm going to do a little bit of a glaze right in this area to soften it slightly more. So I apply that paint, I work in this circular motion. You can see that in this process, we do take away that contrast, a little bit of that saturation because we are working with a titanium white, and it's making things a bit more soft, a bit more digestible. This whole area doesn't feel like the same thing anymore, right? It gives us a bit more visual diversity, and if we feel like we do too much, we can grab some Mars Black, a little bit of that red, hint of the white, not much white though. Work that together, and then if you want a little area here or there to be something a bit more interesting, we can work that in. So don't ever worry about making it too bright or too dark. Play with it, have fun, find the right balance that's right for you and your version of the painting, and really just explore with the process. The channel is called Stay Creative Painting for a reason. While you are following a tutorial and a lesson, I do want you to get creative, to have fun, to interject your own ideas. And here, I hope that acts as a great reminder that you can do that, and you don't have to be fearful. Acrylics, they're just so wonderfully malleable that it's just not something you have to really fight. And with that, we are now going to make a little bit more of that reddish pink, and I'm going to soften this area as well. Working in that circular motion, trying to find different movements though that I can kind of follow for the most part. But softening this is important because it's going to make it more simple and make that a bit more complicated and stand out to a greater degree. I think that balanced the painting right there quite nicely. Do a little bit more, just coming off this center area, maybe into here. Yeah. I think that's really quite neat. So, quite happy with that, and that, though, now I do want just a little bit more pink in the top area. So difficult to stop tweaking once you start. It's one of those wonderful things where, you know, that hobby you picked up is just really hard to put down. Because once you get to this stage of the painting, you just absolutely love what you have, and you can see so much more potential in it. You have these real clear visions for it now that you have something actually, you know, put together on canvas. You've proved to yourself that you can get this far, and you just want to get to that next step, right? So that's essentially the stage we're at. We've moved through a lot of those more awkward portions of the painting, and those again do happen to everyone. Base layers are very important, but now we can really appreciate our work and move confidently with something we do appreciate greatly. That said, while it is starting to look quite nice, we still haven't really incorporated stars. Like a couple here and there, but it's going to expand in a really wonderful way. Everything's going to visually make more sense very soon, and I'm quite excited for that next part of the process. Now what we're going to do is get significantly closer and have some fun plotting some very specific stars that we know we want to stand out in this painting. Again, when I bring up the reference photo, you'll notice that some stars are much larger than others, and those larger stars can aid our composition, and we just want to ensure that we have them kind of throughout the piece, that it doesn't lean to one side or the other. And it's also worth noting that I'm going to paint these with a couple of different layers. The first one is going to start with some of our blue here. Going to grab a hint of our Mars Black, not much at all. Taking off the majority here on my palette. I'll just work that in, and then I'm getting quite a bit of titanium white. This is going to mix up a nice muted blue here. It's not too saturated, it's not too dark, it's not too light. It's a really good start to our stars. And now, again, I'm just going to look at the photo, say where the brightest areas, and I'll apply that little application right there. I'll apply one right here. You want them to be slightly different sizes every time. Now, obviously, as you, do dozens of these, that becomes a little bit more difficult, but you want to try your best. And that's exactly what we're doing here. There we go. Now that we have those initial applications applied, I'm going to take that paint off my brush, make it a little bit damp, and then we're just going to work around our edges and try to soften things a little bit. That way, this layer can be looked at as a little bit of a glow, light coming off the stars which we are yet to fully render. So I'm working in those circular motions right around those applications. There we go. Definitely has a bit of a glow, but you can definitely also see some almost line work occurring there. And we don't want that. We want it to be significantly more randomized visually. And we are going to paint stars with a different technique in a little bit, which will help randomize them. But for now, this is what we are kind of starting with to, again, guide that composition. And then once we have what we want here, we can start moving on to our next set of applications. That said, let's add one right here. Let's try to break these two lines that we have going on. Let's add another one right here. I don't want to add too many of the blue into the pink. I think as I get closer to here, for the most part, I'll switch over to more of a grayish white. Could still have a hint of blue in it because we want it to have a little bit of hue. Give it some color depth, right? But we don't need to do too much. And you can see that I'm really just bouncing around. All of these stars are relatively large, and we're going to definitely implement some smaller ones in a little bit. But now that we have a good number applied, we'll take that pigment right off of our brush, work in that circular technique, soften what we have going on here. Makes them look much more subtle, which is nice. There we go. Sometimes they make the glow much larger, sometimes much smaller. Again, the goal should always be just diversity through this technique. With that, I think we've kind of done a lot right here. Let's move over to the other side for a second. Now, something fun we're going to do here is we're actually going to make that backing glow with a little bit of our cadmium red light hue, Mars black, and titanium white instead. So we're changing it up a little bit, trying to get a bit of a muted orange here. And then, again, we just look for the best places to plot these stars, similar sizes to what we've previously established. And we're working with the cadmium red light hue for this rather than the cadmium red, because the cadmium red and the titanium white would render more of a pink, where this is more of a desaturated orange. And if you remember with the blue, we do want more of a desaturated color for this set of applications. There we go. So now that we have a spotted painting, we can take our brush, go back in, work rounded applications, soften those edges. You can really just blend them out if you want to. Just give that particular spot of canvas a little bit of transparent warmth. That'll also act as a Nice subtle glow, right? There we go. You might have to apply a little bit more pressure with the ones that have been applied for a while. But we definitely got it to a point of being nice and subtle. Here we're mixing up more of that pigment. Again, grabbing a hint of Mars Black just so we ensure that it's not hypersaturated. There we go. And you can even throw some of these, just a couple, over into the pink if you want to. Maybe layer it on top of part of the blue. Lots of different ways of making this much more interesting. And you can see quite a difference between the harsh applications that are initially applied and then the softer ones. Makes a big difference to go back. There we go. Making good use of our water in this step. So now as we step back, we can continue the process, but with a better idea of how everything's working balance-wise. Again, that's something we've mentioned a lot throughout this lesson, and it's just so important when you're working with subjects that do look a bit more abstract, because, of course, you don't have the general ideas of realism to kind of carry the painting. You do have to focus more so on the composition, the balance, how everything kind of works together in conjunction with every other piece. And here we are just creating more of those stars, but from a bit of a distance. Might be a good tip to kind of hold the brush like this. That way you know you can work from a bit of a farther. Oh, that looks nice. I like that a lot. Sorry, got a little distracted. We are starting to move some of the oranges in and around the blues, and it's the combination of the two that's going to look absolutely lovely, because of course orange and blue are complementary colors. They are opposite to each other on the color wheel, and when put beside each other they really pop and create a special aesthetic. There we go. We'll also work a little bit of our blue over into our oranges. This is all just something that kind of takes place over time, right? There's a lot of them to do. And in a lot of scenarios, I don't actually paint stars like this because it can be a little bit tedious and you're slightly limited in the sizing that you can apply. But because this is predominantly a space scene, we need to ensure that we're really doing all that we can to bring out all of these beautiful natural features, right? So we are putting that extra time in with the stars. We are creating these larger ones as well. And I think it's starting to pay off quite nicely. There we go. Might bounce around a little bit. See other areas that could be a little bit more full. Implement them as well. And of course, now we need to take that paint off our brush. Soften a couple things. Just such a cathartic process. You're always doing something different, but you're never really afraid of failing here. We're taking it slow. We're doing a good job. With that, let's grab a little bit of our blue, Mars Black, Titanium White, mix that together. Nice, fairly gray, but still with a little bit of blue. And I think that is ideal for moving down into these areas. It's subtle, but it definitely adds something. Really coming together. That said, it is the final star application that's really going to bring this piece home. It'll make a big difference. Really liking what we have so far, though. Now, we have applied a lot of this, and one thing I don't want to do is overdo it. So, I think what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take a 5-minute break. I'm going to completely remove myself from the canvas, from this area, and then I'll come back, give it a very objective look, ask myself if it needs more in any particular area, if it needs less, because we can just go back and cover it up with our previous applications, right? Should we need to. And then from there, we can decide if we move on to the next step of the stars, or if we continue to proceed with what we're doing right here. So, it's been a couple of minutes now, and coming back to this, I am very happy with the amount we have, but I did notice the affinity I had for this, and this, and I wanted something more so on the bottom half of the painting as well. That way it didn't feel like it all existed at the top, and I'm thinking of applying one right here. If you look, it's slightly to the right of this one, but far to the left of this one. It's very much in its own kind of category zone-wise, and so I think what we're going to do is we're going to take some of our cadmium red light hue, a little bit of our Mars black, hint of our titanium white, and by a hint I mean quite a bit, because we are painting a glow here. Some additional orange, and I think that's very close to what I want. Yeah, that right there is it. Now again, I'm just checking my lines. I'm saying, okay, you know what, this area right here looks like it'll be a great spot for a bright, larger glow. So I'm applying that, taking the extra pigment off my brush, and we'll approach in the same way we did so many other applications. There we go. And we can grab some more, reapply it to the middle, build it up a bit, because when you look at these, you can tell that the middle is relatively opaque. It just has a wider amount of light that's coming off of it. And I think we can do another small one right here, just so it doesn't look out of place at all. Working to the right with it so that again it isn't in the same kind of vertical column as what we have there. And I might expand on a couple of others. I think I like that a lot. Again, it's one of those things where it's hard initially to be objective about, because the process is so much fun. Because it in itself looks really nice when isolated. The question is, does it work with everything else? And again, I think I'm going to take like a 5-minute break, completely remove myself, and then I'll come back, look at it, and we'll answer that question together. After reviewing, I was really quite happy with our results, so we are going to move on to the next step here, where we essentially find a lot of these little spots, the blue and orange ones, and we make them quite a bit brighter. Here we'll take some titanium white, we'll take the smallest hint of our blue, I do mean the absolute smallest amount possible. You know, I'll mix up a new spot right here, and we'll just tap right in the middle that little bit of light. Like that. You can see that I'm bouncing around from area to area. Again, this is a process where once we apply this paint, if we want, we can go back in and soften it. Give it that real glow. And I'm also trying to not apply pressure. So with some of these, I'm getting a lot more of an impact than I am with others, and that some are much more opaque. I'm also just creating brand new ones as well. trying my hardest to keep it diverse despite the fact that we're using a singular brush and one method of application. I'm also going to apply a number of them over here because we didn't with the orange or blue. I didn't want to kind of blend all of that with the pink that we had going on. But we can definitely apply these. Out in the distance. Really liking how it's turning out. I feel like there are some pieces where you feel like you're constantly going back, changing things, fixing things, but this one I feel like we're just continuously, progressively moving in the right directions. It's really wonderful. And certainly, again, not always the case. Now I think I'm going to expand to the top and the bottom, and I will show you our next star technique. But, again, I also wanted to show you that once we have these, we can just kind of blend them out a little bit, make them softer if we want to, don't have to. Entirely up to you. I was going to simply skip ahead to the next step as this one is a little bit repetitive, but I did want to show you another shot of it from a bit of a distance so you can see just how many we're applying, how we're spacing it out. And so here we have that shot and me yet again just kind of dancing around the canvas, starting predominantly in the areas where we've already established either that orange or blue. So now that we have the larger stars implemented, we like them, we like the blends, it's time to start working on the smaller ones that'll really complement them and give them a lot of depth as well. Generally with stars, when you want to create depth, you want to create stars of varying sizes and, varying clusters. The human brain will take over at a certain point. If you are just tapping them on, you will start to create subconscious patterns, and so we want to take that element out of it. We're going to do so by, quite literally, flinging some paint at the canvas. If you've watched the channel for a while, you are very familiar with this technique. I love it for sparks and fire. I love it for things like Starry Nights. And to do this, all we're going to do is we're going to take some titanium white, move it to a relatively clean spot on our palette. We're going to grab just the smallest amount of our blue. I don't want much, I just want to give the stars a slightly cool look and ensure that they, there we go, don't kind of overpower some of the brighter, larger stars that we've created. So once I mix those two, I do grab some extra water with my brush and I mix that into our paint. This is going to thin it very dramatically to the point where it's essentially just like watercolors. Then I'm going to put my palette down, going to peel back the bristles on my brush, and I'm going to launch just a myriad of stars at the canvas. You can see that I'm moving the brush about, peeling back, and continuously moving with that technique. This is going to create hundreds of stars very quickly, but they're going to be incredibly small, which is really, really what we want at this point. We have the big ones. Now we want the ones that are going to add depth to the piece and create that diversity. So you're going to have to do this a number of times, but every time you do, you'll get a little bit farther, you'll get slightly more stars, and it's a great process because it doesn't do too much too quickly. You don't have to worry that you're going to overdo it. You have this a longer extended period to make it the way you really want to. Also, if you're wondering why I'm taking these little breaks from doing that, I'm just continuously mixing more paint on my palette so that I can go back into this and really have some fun with it. It's also worth noting that you can make the splatters directional. If you get really close to the canvas and you position your brush in the angle that you want, you can get the paint to fling up in that specific direction. So right now I'm trying to get it all to move that way. I'll also have it move that way. And yeah, it's it's a very freeing process, but it's definitely one that you can take control over and render something that is going to be different every single time. And that's exactly what we're going for here. Just adding hundreds of little stars so quickly. Avoiding creating a visual sameness and making it look really quite nice in the process. I noticed that this corner doesn't have all that many, so here I'm focusing on that for a minute. Definitely helped out a lot. Continuously grabbing more water, more paint. I love this technique. That said, be very careful with what you have going on behind the canvas, because often you will end up with some splatter on the floor, on the desk, on really whatever you have in that area. And it can be quite funny. You can get some very nice, patterned computers. That definitely happened to my laptop a number of times. I was just going about this process. I had my laptop kind of behind the painting as I was looking at the reference photo and the traceable. And then after the painting process, I look at my laptop and I say, why is it spotted? Why does it have this, very interesting, it didn't look bad, but it had this splattered starry effect, and obviously it was because I was just painting like this. So if you are concerned about your floors, I do heavily recommend putting down a mat or just doing this in an area where you can kind of paint freely. I have a couple exercise mats on the floor right kind of in the setting, so I'm not worried about it, but there have been scenarios where I did need to be. Oh, there we go. That's really nice. Definitely wanted more in this area, and I'm trying to build it up through here because this area, it was fairly open, fairly void of detail, and we did that intentionally, but the stars will really fill it out in a great way. Again, I think we've been at this for probably 5 minutes now, just gathering more paint and continuing the process. You can also hold it farther back to make it less directional and kind of get almost the entirety of the canvas. If you just want something to kind of add everywhere and accent the piece in that way, which is not a bad idea at all. So that's what I'm going to do with this next application after I mix up a little bit more paint. Yeah, it's much more of a subtle look because we're just getting little bits everywhere rather than it being hyper concentrated, but I like that a lot. With that, let's hop back into a close-up and continue adding some larger stars now that we have a good base to kind of work off of. So now that we're back to being closer up, you can really tell the big difference that process did make, and I'm very, very happy with it. But we now have a good idea of how many stars we're going to have in general, so we can focus more so on the ones that we want to stand out and be a bit more prominent. I know that I want one right about here. I know that I want it to have a bit of a glow, so I'm going to apply that pigment initially, same color that we just used, the white and the blue. I'm going to blend out the edges like so. I'm going to grab a bit more, apply that right there in the middle. Maybe do a bit more of a blend out. I want this one to be more so prominent to balance the other blues and nice glows that we have going on in the other side of the painting. We are breaking out the finger painting as well. One of our best techniques. I always say that half jokingly, but I also very much, do half mean it. I think it can be quite useful. There we go. Just so much paint on the canvas right now. All layered. Different levels of depth, different hues. Lots of little glowing effects. I think I'm going to touch up the bottom of this one right here. Yeah. And this part of the process is very much going to change and differ depending upon your painting and where all of your stars ended up being. It's very much a subjective thing. How many stars do you want? How much light do you want them to emit? How prominent do you want them to be? And, what areas do you really want to bring out? Or, if there's an area that you don't really love all that much, maybe you just avoid adding stars to that area so that it isn't something that kind of captures the eye in the same level. Maybe it's just this darker area of the canvas that doesn't get as much visual attention. Very much an option. Really depends on what you want to do. And with that, I think I'm actually very happy with it. It was predominantly that area that I wanted to touch up, maybe a little bit at the bottom, but it's, I think it's there. I'm very, very satisfied with how this ended up coming together. Also, this little bit of blue in here, looking beautiful. Didn't want to do a lot of it initially. Wanted to kind of take my time and make sure I wasn't overdoing it, but now that we have all of those stars in there, it's great. It's really nice in there. It's also incredibly difficult to just stop. Very cathartic. There we go. Okay. There's another one. I think we're going to take a step back, see how it looks, and determine if, perhaps we have finished the lesson. So as we step back, we do get to see our painting in what I am going to call its completed form. I am incredibly happy with how all these stars turned out in both forms, painting them on and just kind of flinging them on the canvas. I think that they mix beautifully. I think we have the right amount. I think that it's balanced, and I am very, very happy with this piece. It was one of those that's just incredibly difficult to put the brush down in because so many of these applications are very cathartic. I think that we all kind of subjectively have different subjects that we enjoy painting. Like, we just love that process, and this is definitely one for me. I hope you very much share that with this lesson, and I'd like to thank you for being here for this lesson. I hope that you had a great time. I hope that you feel inspired, that you go out and you create something fantastic, that you feel like you've learned something, and that you just really enjoyed the painting journey here with me. I try to do a lot of space scenes on this channel. It's something that I'm definitely passionate about, and I do feel like this one is our best, which is always just a wonderful feeling. I mean, we work on these things so much, and year after year you do want to see that continued growth, and I do feel like this is a great representation of that. So I hope you also render your best space scene and you have a wonderful time doing it as well. I'd like to thank you for being here, and if you are still here, you are one of the very special few who do feel the desire to really learn, to soak in as much information as you can. And so if you have made it this far, leave a comment in the comment section and try to incorporate the word stars. It's that simple. Just find a way to fit that into a sentence. That way I know you made it to the end of the lesson. Everybody else who made it this far will also see that. It'll be like a little badge of honor, something I like to do, and generally I do it with a term that's a bit more easily noticeable. So this time I want to go with something a lot more subtle. That way people can't just kind of see it and say, oh, that must be the word for the video. Okay, we'll type that in. So again, just keeping it a bit more subtle, type that in the description. And I'd also, again, just like to say thank you to you for taking this time, for sitting through this lesson with me. It was a real pleasure. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to everybody up over on Patreon who is supporting the channel, who's ensuring that these longer lessons can be made. In no world without your support would I be able to spend the time making these and, doing the multiple versions, the multiple drafts that generally do end up having to occur here. If you watch this and you say, oh, he's so good, he gets it on the first try. Not always the case. In a lot of scenarios, I do these lessons, 2, maybe 3, maybe 4 times, just to really perfect the process, get the layering correct, and ensure that when I teach it to you, it's as good as it can possibly be. I don't ever just want to kind of jump into a lesson and be like, this is how you do it, I want to think about it. I want to really get that process down so that when I'm teaching it to you, you get the best information possible. That said, I do also very much believe in including my mistakes, and you will see that throughout these lessons, just because I think you can learn a lot through mistakes, and some of them I do like to keep in there and ensure that we talk about, because they might be common, and I think it's probably just good information. But yeah, thank you to all of the patrons who do support the channel. As you say, keep the lights on. And if you are new to the channel, you can support the channel up over on Patreon. Up there we do have the traceables, the reference photos, so you can print that out, use it for proper color matching, and just kind of aid yourself in that drawing process. We also have all 5 of my ebooks, including Acrylics for Beginners. In that we do essentially talk about the essentials, everything you need to know about acrylic painting from start to finish. We talk about glazing, compositions, what brushes to use, how much water to use, how to blend your colors, really all of it, and it's just a great way to start, and I'd heavily recommend giving that a read. We also have a bunch of books full of traceables for those days where you really want to create something but you're not sure what you want that creation to be. Great for those situations and kind of just getting you started, giving you that line work, so you don't kind of have to worry about the drawing process. It's also worth noting that we do have a private Facebook group up there where we all kind of share our artwork, talk about it, and it's a great way to just meet like-minded, friendly people who are working on similar pieces, get ideas from them. I do always encourage people to follow these lessons, learn from them, but also take them in your own direction, have fun with it, make it your own. There are so many rules in art, but I think the best art is born when you are breaking those rules and having fun with it. So I heavily implore you to do that, have fun, create what you want to create, and yeah, so I'm not going to continue on for too long there, but if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so, link in the description, and I will see you very soon with a brand new episode of the painting series. So thank you for being here, stay creative, stay safe, and have a lovely day.